Hello, everyone. Welcome to our fourth diverse webinar. It's great to have you. We're looking forward to another awesome webinar. So throughout this, if you have any questions, you can just put them into the chat and we'll get to them at the end of the session. And if you're more interested in speaking your question, just wait until the end and then you can put your hand up and we'll give you the chance to talk and ask Brad your question directly. So before we get started, I just want to begin with a land acknowledgement. The University of Alberta respectfully acknowledges that we are located on Treaty 6 territory, a traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many others whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to influence our vibrant community. And so now I'd like to welcome our speaker. Brad Pino received his Bachelor of Science and Master of Science in Forestry from the University of Alberta and his PhD in Soil Science from the University of Saskatchewan. He has also held postdoctoral positions at the University of Regina and University of Alberta, worked as a forester with the provincial governments in Alberta and Saskatchewan, taught in the Forestry Technician Program at Northern Lakes College, and was a research scientist with the Canadian Forest Service Northern Forestry Centre. His research interest is in understanding the links between site, silvics, and operational treatments to refine silvicultural practices to meet the growing demands on our forests. And Brad is also our Theme 6 lead, as well as one of the co-leads on the Diverse project. So welcome, Brad, and I'll let you take it away.
All right, thanks very much, Catherine. Okay, I will start my presentation here. There we go. Okay, so thanks very much, everybody, for being here. So, like Catherine said, I'm a silviculture prof here at the University of Alberta. Within the context of diverse, I'm the Theme 6 lead, which is what we're going to be talking about today, which is the silvicultural trials. Yeah, so I guess I'll start with a bit of a caveat here in that we don't have a lot of answers to these things. What I'm going to show today is really about our way of thinking about this and our way of maybe addressing this question. So the implementation of alternative silviculture treatments, we haven't done these yet. We're talking about doing these now. And so I think that it's an interesting time in that we can be thinking about what the treatments are that we want to be testing for the future, what species we want to be growing, all those sorts of things. But if you're coming looking for answers to these questions, we probably don't have them yet. But that's where we are at in this process right now. Okay, so if you've been involved in any of the diverse stuff up until this date, you have seen this slide a lot. But what I want to do is just take a couple of seconds and talk a little bit about one of the reasons that I'm involved in diverse, why I'm involved in this project here. And I think this slide kind of sums up a lot of that quite nicely. But often with diversity and just diverse in general, when we're talking about this in forestry context, we're thinking about species and species diversity and biological diversity and things like that. But I think that's a lot bigger than this, and that highlights this slide highlights that as all these different organizations that are involved in this. This is a big project. We have industrial partners, we have government partners, we have academic partners, we have Indigenous communities, we have not-for-profit organizations involved in this as well. So there's a diversity of members, a diversity of land management objectives, a diversity of opinions, and a diversity of ideas on how we should be managing our forest. So to me, that's really a lot of the part of this idea of diverse. It's a lot more than just biological diversity. It's a diversity of everything else involved in this project. Okay, so the study footprint. So this is probably seen this map before too, but this is just all the areas that we've got where we're going to be evaluating different parts of diverse in. Diverse is a big project. We're not doing everything everywhere, but this is the land base that's been kind of committed to doing some of those analyses on. And a subset of these are where we're going to be doing the silvicultural trials in. But what I want to highlight here is this idea of this partner value and what we hope to accomplish from this project. So first is a way to redefine how forestry is perceived. We know there's big challenges in forests. There's environmental challenges. There's challenges with what people want from our public forests in particular. what is that? We know we're going to need to do forestry different. So how is that going to be part of it? And that's going to be one of the big questions we're getting out of it. Testing a novel approach, increase adaptability and resilience. A lot of that relates directly to the silviculture trials that we're going to be talking about today, but actually on the ground testing of some of these ideas that we've got. We're going to do field trials, but we're also going to be doing a lot of modeling studies that are looking at this sort of stuff too. And the other one, this third one, navigate better, increasing social and environmental uncertainties in the future. So looking at the future, I think one of the biggest things that we're going to get out of this big research project, and this is a big, cross-Canada project here, is a lot of the graduate students that we're going to be working with. We're going to have graduate students working at these different sites, working with different researchers, working with different partners. And those are the folks that are going to be the forest managers of the future, right? So the more that we can, thinking about what we can give to the students is going to help make that that objective come true, I think. So that's a little bit about what I see as the background of diverse, and that's my, I'm not trying to speak on behalf of the whole diverse team, but that's one of the reasons why I'm kind of involved in this, is for some of those things. Okay, so getting into the actual diverse project now, we set up different themes. So theme 1 looking at the forest resiliency, theme 2 looking at different species, themes 3 and 4 looking at modeling, theme 5 looking at the socioeconomic conditions here, and then theme 6 is looking at silvicultural treatments and installing new sites. So there's a lot going on there, and there's a lot of interactions between these ones. Really what we're going to be talking about here is theme 6, but I'm going to try and highlight some of those links to some of these other themes. So link to what's going on in theme 2 with identifying suitable species, links to what's going on in theme 5, work that Harry's doing with the socioeconomic indicators and acceptability and all this sort of stuff, right? So we'll try and talk about some of those as we're going through it. But when I was starting here, I wanted to look at our NSERC proposal and what are the actual deliverables that we've got here from theme 6. So one of the first ones is evaluating performance from existing studies. I'm mostly going to be talking about new studies, but we also wanted to look at old studies. So for example, in that top photo there, that's Wayne Bell and crew from Ofri in Ontario, but at the NEB plot. So we've now got a graduate student, Kyle Dews, who's working with the Ontario government, looking at kind of some of the past data from the NEB plots, which is looking at different silvicultural intensities and different site types in Northern Ontario, but they were established that 20 years ago. So we can learn from what's going on in past studies. So I think that's a really important part of it. We know that, the results from silvicultural trials take a long time to get often, right? We can get initial results, but to see really where we're going, it can take decades sometimes. So we're going to try and use some existing studies to answer some of those questions. So one of the other deliverables here was evaluate potential for links to other themes. So that's kind of linking to the other groups here. I'll point out some of that as we're going through. Establish new silvicultural trials across Canada. This is what I'm going to spend most of the time talking about, is kind of what we're envisioning for that. And then monitoring results from the first year post-trial initiation. So when I'm thinking about what is success for me in this project, we're in year 2 of Diverse now. We've got a 5-year project here. Really, the silvicultural trials take a long time to get established. Takes time to get approvals for harvesting, growing trees for seedlings for planting. All that stuff takes a long time. So when I think about what success is here, if we can get these trials established in the course of the next couple of years, next 4 years, I guess, before Diverse is up, that would be a huge success, I think, for this project. Some might be a little bit earlier, so we might get some years, some growth responses or some data from these trials, but really it's getting these established that I'm looking at as the big reward at the end of this. Okay, so that is the deliverables for the whole project. I'm really just going to be talking about this, establishing these new silvicultural trials and what that's going to look like. We can talk about some of the other stuff if people are interested in afterwards, but really what I want to focus on here is these new trials here today. So silviculture field trials. This is kind of my general idea of what that, how this kind of relates to some of the other themes and what we're trying to do here. But we're trying to take the information from these other themes and apply it on the ground, right? And so, for example, theme 2 is a tree species. So which of the species we should be growing in these different areas for the future, right? What growing there now. Maybe that's appropriate for the future. Maybe it's the same species, maybe it's different species, all those sorts of things. The other part is, what are people expecting from our forests? What is some of the work that's being done right now with theme 5 about what do we want from our forest? How comfortable are people with different silvicultural treatments, for example, on the landscape? Hopefully that can feed into what some of these trials are going to be. How comfortable are people with, new species, for example? I don't know, but maybe this is one that we want to be talking about. So what information can we use from these other themes that's going to lead into this development of our trials? And then from our silvicultural trials, how can we lead to other things? So how can we feed into some of the landscape modeling that's going on in themes 3 and 4? Can we propose some different treatments which maybe they haven't done, haven't thought of modeling yet, different species combinations or different harvesting treatments, for example. I think that's a really important one, is kind of our silvicultural trials take place at the stand level. But then we really want to be looking at, the impacts across the landscape scale. So that's that link between different scales. So we're going to go from the, individual tree level at many of our responses to the stand level responses, and then shifting that up to the landscape scale responses and different combinations of these things across the landscape. And we're going to be doing that through a lot of the modeling. The other part with the forest governance and economics, can we, part of the question of we're doing new treatments here is there's differences in what these are going to cost compared to what we're currently doing. How can we look into that? Is there stuff that, Harry's group can be looking at here is different expenses for these different treatments? How does that compare to what we're currently doing? So, feeding into different models or different themes that way as well. Okay, so that's kind of a little bit of the kind of diverse project context. I also wanted to provide a bit of the kind of scientific and operational context for this. So I teach silviculture here at the university, and one of the things I say a lot in my class is we need more options and more variety in how we practice silviculture, right? I don't think there's one way of doing everything. We need lots of variety, and that's probably more valuable than having the perfect way is having more variety in what is that we're doing. Again, kind of feeding back into that idea of diversity of practices, diversity of treatments is a big part of it. In my view, we need more intensive management. We also need more extensive management. We need both of those on our landscapes across Canada. So in terms of some of the papers that we're seeing coming out, kind of the scientific context for this top one is a recent one out from British Columbia, which has been getting a lot of publicity in the last few weeks here. But they're talking about assisted migration for Douglas fir and the importance of having, existing tree cover to facilitate the establishment of these kind of future adapted trees in these areas. So I think that's a lot of what we're seeing here. And that's one of the things that we want to test here. Does that apply everywhere? Does it apply for all the different species? How far can we move species? What sorts of silvicultural treatments do we need to make that happen? So to me, that's a great kind of segue into what we want to do on a larger scale here. So this other one, intensive silviculture practices enhance the performance of forest species and restoration plantations. Yeah, like what level of intensive silvicultural practices do we need? We were thinking about things like site preparation, thinking about things like competition control. What about tree breeding? What's the role of all of those in looking to growing future forests? Like how can we incorporate some of those practices into what we're doing? And those are some things that hopefully we're going to be able to test through our silvicultural trials. Last one, this paper from D'Amato and Palak on kind of this idea of different paradigms in silviculture. So there's kind of the idea of ecological and adaptation silviculture. How similar, how different are they? I think we're building on both of those in this idea here. And actually, I think also linking some of the intensive silviculture treatments as well in what we're doing, but what can we add to that idea of what is it that we're trying to do out on the landscape? And in many ways, we can be meeting multiple objectives from these treatments. And I think that kind of sets up that idea of just, we're not, how do I say this, is there's lots of different objectives that we can be meeting through our silvicultural practices here. Other things on more the operational side of it, we often think in the boreal forest is, well, we need to be doing, clear-cut silviculture, and other models don't work. Continuous cover models don't necessarily work here. But this recent book came out from the boreal Nordic countries on continuous cover forestry in their part of the world. So there's different models that we can be looking at to learn from and what different things that we could be doing. A little bit closer to home, the Silviculture Innovation Program is from British Columbia, where they're looking at what are some of the different treatments that we could be doing? How can we do innovative silviculture here? And so I think that's all of these sorts of things that we need to be thinking about in terms of more variety of silviculture, more diversity of treatments on there. We need to be thinking about wood supply. We need more wood in the future. We know that. Where's it going to come from? How are we going to be growing our forest to be able to provide that? But we also need to be thinking about, changing environments, climate as part of it, but also, societal expectations of forest management and of our public forests is all part of the context of what we're trying to look at here. Okay, so hopefully that sets a little bit of the context what I want to talk about in terms of the silvicultural trial network. Sites across Canada in different ecosystems. This is the same map showed earlier, except now there's different colors. What we've got here is the green ones are the sites where we're hopefully going to have silvicultural trial installations going in. So we've got them across the country from British Columbia all the way to Nova Scotia, right? Each of these is being led by an industrial partner at each of the sites. And I think I just want to be really clear that we're asking a lot of these folks, right? We're asking a lot of our partners here. Yes, Diverse is a big project with a lot of money, but that money is really for the research side of it, for graduate students, things like that. We're now asking the partners we're putting in these silvicultural trials to do even more, right? Arrange the harvesting crew and pay for that, supply the seedlings and source all the seed that you're going to need for growing them. All of that, all at the same time while doing another full-time job too, right? So this is, part of bringing this all together is how we're going to balance all of those kind of competing demands and things like that on it. But, really, this is going to be led by the partners at each of these sites making it happen. So in terms of what we've got here is we want to have consistent treatment. So there's a couple of harvesting and revegetation treatments I want to talk about. They're going to be consistent across the network, but there's going to be local context. So what I mean by that is, in southern Alberta, maybe we're looking at, a variety of different conifer species, maybe Douglas fir and ponderosa pine, for example, whereas in the east, it can be different species, right? So maybe we're dealing oaks and maples and, different pines or things like that. But, but the treatments are going to be similar, but some of the contexts that we've got for them are going to be a little bit different and vary depending on the forest we're in. The other thing I think that's important here is compatible with other studies. So there's other studies that are going on across North America, whether it's the ASK trial, the DREAM trial. All of these sorts of things are pretty similar to what we're doing, and I'm hoping there's going to be a lot of overlap and a lot of compatibility between these studies, and we'll be able to expand the range of where we're testing some of these things by doing this. But I will say this has been purposely designed to be able to be somewhat compatible, at least with what other folks are doing. It's never going to be exactly the same, but I think there's going to be enough overlap that it should be okay. Okay, so what I want to do now is kind of go over the experimental design here a little bit, and then I'll end with an example of what we're working on at one of their sites here in Alberta. Okay, so the proposed experimental design. So we're hoping to get this in at, let's say 10 to 12 sites across the country, different forest types, different ecological regions, different climate zones, different future projections, right? So that's all going to be part of it. But what we want is that we want each installation to be a standalone research study as well as being part of this larger network. So what that means is replication at each installation. So hopefully four of these replicates at each site that were at each of the main installation sites. We'll be able to analyze each of them. Will be able to be analyzed individually, as well as we can look at the across the whole network in the future. So that's kind of the goal of what we're looking at here. So some of the first things, starting with site selection. So what are we looking for? What we've been doing is going around and talking to each of these different groups for the last 6 months or so, I guess, about what is this going to look like. So some of the questions on site selection: are we looking at specific site types, so different soils or different topography that you're interested in? Is site selection dependent on forest cover type that you're looking at? All those sorts of things can go into this, and there's no right or wrong answer here. But what we want people to be doing is thinking about being purposeful in what they're doing. So that's part of site selection is, can we actually get in there and install these treatments? So close to roads, in the harvest sequence for the next few years. There's a lot of these logistical things as well as the more scientific questions that are going into making some of those decisions. So the harvest treatment and revegetation treatments, I'll go into a little bit more detail here, but briefly, the harvest treatments are kind of a clear cut versus a partial harvest. And the revegetation treatments, we've got 4 different treatments that we're looking at trying there as part of this. Okay, harvesting treatments. The 2 harvesting treatments we're looking at are partial harvest versus clear cut harvesting. So partial harvest, you can think shelter wood or seed tree type harvest. This is a shelter wood from a pine forest. Part of the goal here is to create different understory conditions, right? So we know that in the understory, they're more protected environments. So it's darker, it's cooler, it's moister, right? They're more protected from environmental extremes. So whether it's hot, really high temperatures in the summer, whether it's frost in the spring and falls, all that sort of stuff. There's more protection from the environmental extremes in these areas. There's also less competition from other vegetation, right? So this might be the perfect environment for some species that we're trying to regenerate. Others, maybe not so much. Maybe this is a great one for more shade tolerant species, not so much for really shade intolerant species. For example, that might be how this plays out. On the other side, we've got clear cutting, which is essentially the standard practice across much of the boreal forest and really most of Canada on public lands. In this area, you've got maximum resources, right? So we've got light, water, nutrients. There's the most possible availability of these resources. Accompanied by that is the most vegetation competition, right? And so vegetation does respond to this. How does that influence how the trees are growing in these areas? So we're trying to create these different environmental conditions. We're also trying to create these differences in treatments. Again, is we want to test not only what we're currently doing, but also something different. So that idea of diversity of treatments is again coming out in our harvesting treatments here. So for most of Canada, clear-cut harvesting is the standard, and partial harvest would be the alternative or the different treatment. But when we're talking to folks in Nova Scotia, partial harvesting is their normal harvest methods, and clear-cut would be the alternative treatment or the different treatment, right? So we're trying to incorporate what standard practices with other parts, with other treatments as well. In terms of the regeneration treatments, kind of got these 4 levels, but starting with standard practice. So essentially, generally, what's the accepted practice across the public lands in Canada is generally regenerating with local trees, right? And so it's the business as usual. So, for example, here in Alberta, this is the map of the current seed zone. This is being revised and as we speak, but the idea is generally it's assumed that local trees are going to be better adapted to those sites, and in general that makes sense. If conditions are staying the same. If they're not, then maybe they're not the best adapted for the future, right? So that leads us into the second one, kind of assisted population migration. So here we're using the terminology from the assisted migration world, but essentially what we're thinking here is the same species, but more southern population. So moving things as we're expecting them to be moving with climate, right? So it's same species, but just kind of future adapted species. So, So I don't think there's much contention about these. This is kind of what we're currently doing versus being a little bit aggressive and pushing for the future. Our third one is pushing that a little bit even further. So assisted range expansion. So this is introducing species that are not currently present in that area or on those sites. So maybe they're going to be native species. We've had some groups talking about non-native species. Maybe there's some good reasons to use species from other parts of the world, which might be really well suited for the conditions that we're going to be getting here in the future. So this might be a place to try them. We're not trying to put any values on this. It's just kind of what are the species that we want to try here. Maybe they're moving them a little ways, maybe they're moving them a long ways to get there. And we do have some tools that can help us make some of these decisions as to which species might be appropriate, which ones might not work so good. But in this one, I think is where there's probably the most discussion happening in this assisted range expansion, most discussion happening about which species, where we're going to get them from, all that stuff. So the fourth one is what we're calling local questions. But what we wanted to do is provide a place. What are the questions that people are asking? What are the challenges that they're having? Is it having to do with, is there a local species that's part of our forest but quite rare? Is there something, some species that has some specific values that we're looking at? Are we interested in natural regeneration? Are we interested in competition control alternatives? Are we interested in site prep, planting density, stock sizes, you know, all these sorts of things? What are the important local questions that we have, and what can we do to address them within this framework of, you know, different harvesting treatments within this diverse network? So hopefully this is going to be an interesting one. That the first three are probably going to be fairly similar in approaches across the country. This last one is probably going to be very different between sites. So, you know, that I think could be quite interesting. And you know, it also gives us an opportunity to incorporate some of these variety of different different priorities into what we're doing in terms of the research here. So the next part that we've got here is we're asking each of the sites to set up a local steering committee. Okay, so it involves the local site lead, involves researchers. So maybe that's somebody who's already in diverse. Maybe it's another researcher that the groups are working with, whatever. But just having somebody involved on the research side of it to make sure we're kind of balancing the operational demands with the research demands here. The other part that's really important here is having local community input. So whatever that looks like, and that's going to be different across the country. Some groups are looking at using their existing advisory committee. So I've gone out and presented at some of the advisory committees here about the project, and that's going to be happening across the country, I think, as we get moving on this. But this infrastructure might already be there as to, you know, getting people engaged. You might already have those groups in place. Hope there's going to be, you know, some discussions about what the research is going to look like. What are some of the priorities? Hope there's some field tours that are involved in some of this as well. I think there's also, this is another thing, the idea of linking to the theme 5, which is more the social side of it. But also this idea of kind of coming back to the fundamental concept of diverse is it's a diversity of ideas as well. And this is how one way that we're going to try and incorporate them right from the very beginning into our research design, you know, talking about which species we want to get there. What are these local questions that we really want to be addressing in each of the sites? So that's kind of all of is built into that. Okay, in terms of timelines. So some of the stuff we've been working on this for a while now, but I think really where we're at is, you know, we're still at the beginning of this for the most part. We're talking about site selection. So where do we want to be doing this? Where is it even possible to do this? So probably starting out with more of a GIS exercise, looking at the future harvest areas, things like that. Setting up local steering committees. So and this is happening in at different speeds in different places, but that's kind of where we're at. The other one is, you know, starting to think about the pre-harvest measurements now. We want to be able to, what does our forest look like there now in terms of getting a baseline for the future of those forests with these different treatments. Really, we're looking at harvesting maybe a year from now, more likely for most of the sites 2 years from now. These things take a long time to plan. When we're dealing with public lands, we need to get approvals for doing all of this stuff. We need to get all the work done to make it happen. That just takes a long time. Hopefully they'll be able to get some done, you know, harvest next winter. Most are probably going to be a year after that, and reforestation after that, and then get into the monitoring. And then honestly, that's the end of our project. So one of the things I said earlier was that success for me in this is getting these sites established. And this is a lot of work. It really is. I don't think I can understate that at all, but it's a lot of work that we're going into these, and we're asking the partners to do. So what I want to do now is go through an example of one of the ones here in Alberta. This is the Sundry Forest Products example. So this is a West Fraser FMA in Alberta, so southern Alberta. And whatever I'm going to say here in the next few minutes I'm not speaking on behalf of West Fraser. We're just at the beginning of this process. What I'm trying to do is highlight some of the discussions that we're having, some of the issues that we're thinking about, some of the challenges that we're anticipating that's going to come with doing this. So I want to kind of just walk through a bit of the process here that we've been going through for this site in specifically. So the map on here, this is where Sundry is. So it's basically in the Rocky Mountain foothills, basically to the west of Red Deer. You can see I took these two figures on the right there out of their forest management plan for the area. But it's a predominantly lodgepole pine forest currently. That's the top one with a species percentages, and then the bottom graph is the age class distribution. So it's a relatively old forest currently. Much of the forest is 90+ years old, with kind of a bit of a gap in the middle-aged classes there. But again, this is fairly common to what we see across much of Alberta's commercial forest. So that's what it's currently like. What's going to like in the future? So one of the things that I want to highlight here is part of this project is, projecting these forest types into the future a little bit. So I really want to highlight some of the work that's being done in theme 2 through Andreas Hammond's lab here. We've got the species selection tool, and maybe I'll just ask Catherine to maybe put that in the chat or wherever. But the link in case you want to go try this out yourself. But it's really a great tool that we can start playing with and getting some sense of where this ecosystem is going to be in the future. So one of the things that I've done is kind of I've taken this from that site, but it kind of charts where they're expecting these different forests to be in the future in terms of climate. So starting in kind of the 1960s, so past climate, 1920s where we're currently, and then 50s and 80s into the future. So we're expecting hotter and wetter or more precipitation, right? That's kind of the expectation moving into the future. What does that mean? So the other part that this site does, it looks like, okay, looking at what the future climate is, what are some current analogs for that climate in terms of the species that are there? Then we can use that to help start informing our decisions here. And so I'll show you what some of that looks like for this site and sundry. But this site is what Andreas has done here is this is specific to the diverse forests. So you can go in if you're interested in the forest in Western Nova Scotia forest, you can actually go in there and look at it. So it's pretty cool. I encourage everybody to get in there and play around with it a little bit. But this is some of the stuff that we've got here. So now we're talking, okay, we can look at this. What does the future hold for us a little bit? What sites are the most vulnerable? What kind of future forests should we be growing? And how are we going to grow them? That's where we're getting into the silvicultural treatments there, right? So first one here, this is, we started talking about site selection. So last summer we went out, and this is kind of the brain trust for the sundry site here. We've got Fraser and Doug from West Fraser, Harry from UBC. We were out there talking about this. Which sorts of sites should we be targeting here for a trial like this? Some of the examples are, should we be looking at south-facing slopes, which are kind of the most vulnerable? Some existing challenges exist, things like Chinooks coming through, and can be some reforestation challenges in there. Is this where we want to be focusing our diverse trial? Perhaps that makes sense to me. Or do we want to be looking at the more mesic sites? So these are the most common sites on the landscape. They're going to be the most common sites in the future as well. So maybe it makes sense to kind of go in those more mesic site types, more vulnerable versus more mesic or most common. This is kind of a conversation I think most of the groups are going through in some form or another. I think both approaches make sense. But regardless, what we really want people to do is be thinking about what it is that they want to be addressing. What's your main issue that you want to be thinking about here with this, and be purposeful in what we're doing. But I think this is a good example of the conversation that we're having across all the different sites. So this is a process that's ongoing. Site selection, kind of the GIS exercise, some of the field scouting is hopefully happening this summer, and then we'll move forward from there. We're talking about harvesting operations in general. The clear cut option is relatively straightforward. We have the equipment, we have the operators, the contractors to do this, who are very good at it. So that we know how to make that happen. On the other side of it, on the partial harvest, lots of questions still. Do we have the right equipment? Can we use the existing equipment? Do we need to get different equipment? How are we going to lay these out? Do we have the right operators to do this? How are we actually going to operationally do this? This is something that's quite different. How are we going to pay for it? It's going to be more expensive. All of these sorts of things are part of the discussion that we're having right now as to how are we going to make this a reality. So again, I think this is one that all of the groups are going to have in some form or another, is go through these kind of conversations. I don't think any of them are insurmountable. I just think they're things that we need to be thinking about as we're moving through this process. So now we'll get into the revegetation treatments. So the first one, of course, is that the business as usual one, which is whatever your current reforestation treatment would be, and in this case, probably planting lodgepole pine for the most part. We'll do that. And for the other ones, it's a little bit more complicated, right? So this is the assisted populations. This is step number 2 on that list. What this figure here is, these are the seed zones that might be applicable for a future or a current climate, sorry. But maybe what it is lodgepole pine and white spruce from southern Alberta and Montana. Perhaps. Maybe that makes sense for that. It's kind of the same species, but kind of from a little bit further south, pushing them northwards. That makes sense. Now some of the questions are, okay, where are we going to source seed from? Local ones we've got, within Alberta, we're probably okay. What if we wanted to get stuff from Montana? How do we do that? How do we get the seed? How do we grow these seedlings? Are they available? All of these sorts of questions come into procuring trees for the future becomes a big issue. If any of you were on our Alberta School of Forest Science and Management webinar last week, we had Trevor Jones from Wood Fiber Center talking about the Ask trial in Petawawa, and he did a great example just explaining the challenges they had with this exact same thing of sourcing where are you going to get the trees from for this. So this is going to be a big challenge that all the sites are going to be dealing with. But bit of an issue here. I don't think insurmountable, and it's going to get even more challenging at the next one here. So as we go into this assisted range expansion, again, these figures are from that species selection tool, but where the future seed sources could be, maybe if we're looking at 2050s, we're down into southern Montana, maybe down into the Black Hills. If we're looking at 2080s, we're down into Nebraska for much of this. So what are the species there? What's available? What does that look like? So that's a long ways away. Do we want to push it that far? And so what we've been talking about with all the groups is we want to try species that we're not sure about. We want to try populations or provenances of these trees, of these species that we're not sure about. If we're pretty sure we're going to be successful, we're probably not going to learn as much as if we're really pushing the envelope, right? So if some trees die, that's okay. We can learn from that. We'll know they only die in certain treatments. Only certain populations die. That's how we're going to learn from this, right? So we do want to push that envelope for what we're trying here. The other one is there tends to be an overall conifer bias across much of Canada, but incorporating some of the hardwood species as well. So then I started looking at this. Okay, so we can take these. What do those populations look like from these future areas? And what we've got, this is just my ideas. Again, I'm not trying to speak on behalf of the local group here, but these are some of the options. Douglas fir, western larch, western white pine, ponderosa pine. Well, those are all fairly close. They're just over the border or even within Alberta, not too far away from our site in Sundre. But we're pushing the envelope a little bit on these ones. What about something like red pine from further east? But maybe that would be another good species we could be trying here. In terms of broadleaf species, what about green ash and bur oak? These are ones that, they are in that 2080 range. They really are right within the where these species are currently growing. So maybe they would be good ones to be trying at least. So this is some of the challenges that we're going through. These are ones that we've got from our species selection tool, but also operationally, how do we get these? I don't know. Can we just go get bur oak trees? Where are they from? I don't know. These are a lot of the questions that we're going to be having and working through, so we can develop a bit of a plan here. But then what we're able to do operationally might be a little bit different in the end, and I think that's okay. So just kind of wrapping up here. Also want to think a little bit about the legacy of these, right? So one of the things that we want is there's going to be a research legacy, but there's also going to be a more of a human legacy. One of the things we've got in the Sundre site is Des Crosley forest. So we would like to put a demonstration site in. This is an existing demonstration forest. It's publicly accessible on a good road. It's part of existing forest education programs. So we currently have we have demonstrations of current forest practices, but not really of future forest practices. So incorporating that right into the demonstration forest here is great. Maybe other people are going to be able to do something similar to that. But be able to use this to highlight the work that we're doing, to be able to highlight what forestry could be in the future, I think is also really important. The other side of this is the research infrastructure. We know that a lot of the results are going to come out not in the next couple of years, but in 5, 10, 20 years down the road. So how do we keep that research infrastructure going in the future? Is there a diverse two coming? Potentially. We've started talking about some of that already as well. But again, if we set this up, one of the things that we actually don't have a lot of in Alberta in particular is a lot of good replicated silvicultural trials like this. So having this, we don't necessarily know what the questions are going to be in the future, but if we design this well, we're going to be able to have the research infrastructure to be able to answer some of those future questions is kind of my goal out of this. Okay, just kind of wrapping up here, but lots of people involved. So if you're interested and want to get involved here's a list of some of the people. This is by no means an exhaustive list. This is just some of the people that we've got involved from different universities, from different companies, from different governmental organizations. Lots of people involved in this, and lots of people are involved in these discussions. If you know some of these people, you want to get involved, reach out to them. And hopefully you'll learn ways that learn about the project, learn about what's going on in your area, or whatever it might be. Also, we've got, if you're interested in more information about the project, our website is really great. Have a look at it. We've got lots of information on there. We've got kind of these fact sheets about the project as a whole, as well as about each of the different themes. If you want to get involved, if you just want to know what's going on in the project, this is a great resource to do that. So you can also just send me an email, and we're happy to kind of follow up with folks as needed. But what I wanted to do here is give a bit of an overview of what we're trying to do. Again, like I said, there's no answers just yet. What we're doing is really, we're hoping to set up this experiment so we can have answers in the future, with this general idea of how are we going to manage the forests going forward into the future. What are the different silvicultural treatments we need? What are the different trees that we should be growing in different parts of Canada? All of that is going to come into the project here. So I will end it there, and hopefully we got some time for some questions if there are any.
Perfect. Thanks, Brad. So if any of you have questions, you can throw them onto the chat or just use the raise hand feature at the bottom of your screen, and then we'll let you talk. Okay, we have some hands raised. There's no name on this one, but it's doyo@uco.ca. I'll allow you to talk first.
Hello, Fred. This is Frederic Doyon from UCO. Thanks for your presentation. I'm quite following what's going on with the diverse, as I have developed an experiment design in SilvAdapt that have been ongoing since 2018. And we have underplanting under different residual basal area. And we base our treatment on some kind of a framework related to resilience and resistance. So I haven't seen any kind of link. The goal is clearly stated. That's what you want to achieve, like, to improve resistance and resilience. But how you link that goal with the design that you propose, I'm missing a link that I would like to better understand.
Yeah, no, that's a good question, and it's I think it's less clearly laid out in our design compared to something like the Ask trial, where it's embedded right in the initial discussions, right? So I think that's one where it's going to come in through some of the, the assisted migration with the vegetation treatments. But you're right, that's one that we haven't, specifically laid out the direct links to, resistance, resiliency, recovery, all that sort of stuff, which we're seeing a lot in the scientific community. The other part of this, as I would say, is these are, the silvicultural trials are only one part of diverse, right? So a lot of that stuff is being covered in some of the other themes as well, right? So I'm thinking about the resiliency or the risks that are being identified in theme 1, right? So we're not necessarily trying to do everything in each individual theme, but as a package, hopefully that is coming together. So, again, I don't know if I'm answering your question. I don't have an exact answer for you, but hopefully, the package of work is making it a little bit clearer, and not just, it's more than just silvicultural trials is what I would say, I guess.
Is there any hypotheses that have been stated yet on any of those experiments?
No, I don't think we're necessarily there just yet. Yeah, it's really in the planning stage. But for example, maybe there will be some that are coming out with those local questions that we're getting at is, they're not necessarily hypotheses, but important operational questions that we're going to be addressing. But I think they could be different at each of the sites as well, right? What's a a big risk in our sites here in Western Canada, where we're looking at, future climates of switching from forest to non-forest might be different issues than what we're dealing with in Eastern North America. We're switching forest types, but likely still to be forest, right? So things like that, there could be some differences across the country.
Yeah, makes sense. Thanks.
Okay, next question we have from Dan. You can go ahead and unmute.
Hey, Brad. Nice to hear your talk. I was thinking a lot of times in assisted migration, and in your talk, you talk about moving southern populations north. And sometimes we seem to see things that suggest moving populations from drier areas into that it's not so much about temperature, but more thinking about the precipitation gradients. And you're saying, a lot of this is in setting up the project. There's so much being invested in setting it up. And I was wondering what the thinking is in really selecting the provenances and even the seed zones. I mean, and at what life stage and what future scenario you're planning for. I mean, you're setting it up for something, and there's seems to be a lot of questions for me on what you're setting it up for and how you're filling in those holes.
Yeah, well, I think you've done a great job of identifying what all those questions are. Yes, exactly. It's not, and I don't have an answer here, but my thinking in general is this idea of diverse is there's probably not one thing. Let's set it up for a whole bunch of different and test a whole bunch of different futures. So that's why we're trying those different levels. But I think there's greater risk in trying to be perfect about what we're doing versus testing a whole suite of options. So that's kind of the approach I'm taking, is let's try that whole suite of options and kind of learn from it, from that way more operationally, trying some of these things. But that's really important is, we're looking at this, so moving species to different areas depending on precipitation. We have variation over years again. So how do we incorporate annual variation into all of this? It might be when trees are small, this is fine. When they're bigger, then maybe they're maladapted in the future. All of these things are going to be part of that discussion, and I'm hoping each of these groups is going to have in some form or another. We want to set it up for the 2050 environment, the 2080 environment, because they have to be able to survive as seedlings now, as well as large trees in 30 years from now. How do we set all of this up? And again, I don't think we have an answer, but what I'm hoping that people are doing is being purposeful in what it is that they're trying to in the species that they're selecting, right? So, or the populations that they're selecting and things like that. So it's more setting it up for some of those discussions and those thoughts to be had, more so than having a clear-cut answer as to what you should be doing right now. So there's not a cookbook on how to do this. What we're hoping to do is set the framework for having those discussions about it at each of the sites.
Okay, so you're doing more than hoping, you're planning, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And we're using some of those tools, right? So, the tool that Andreas has developed is a great example of that. So we can use some of these tools that we're developing within the Diverse project, but there's also lots of other tools that are out there that are great resources. We also have a lot of really smart people who have been working in these areas for a long time. They know what's been going on. So how can we use some of those resources as well to ask the right questions and try the right things?
Okay, thanks, Brad.
Okay, the next question we have is from Nadir.
Hi, thank you very much, Brett. It's a really great talk. It's very interesting information from hearing this kind of things from you. My question, I have two questions. I know we use the term forest health or adaptation very frequently, but that means different things for different people. From your perspective, what is adaptation? Is adapting what? That's number one. Number two, if I'm not mistaken, this entire project and many projects is really the goal is maybe climate change is one factor is that targeting. And there's other aspect is I think is one of the chat comment is about pests, where the pests fits in overall in your silvicultural treatments. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm going to be very, I'll try and answer this. So adaptation, what are we thinking about here? I'm going to be very clear. I have a pretty strong tree bias here. So that's mostly what I'm thinking about. Okay, it's growing trees and stands and forests, right? So that's part of it. But we know that that's not the only part of forests. There's lots of other plants, lots of other organisms that are out there, right? So that's, I think, reflecting more what I'm thinking about here is mostly trees. It doesn't mean to say that other things aren't important. It's just that that's not necessarily what I've been thinking about right now. The other part that I will say is that without the trees, there is no forest either. So it's a reasonable place to start, right? But this is one project, and we've got. If we set this up right, hopefully we can answer some of those questions. What's going to be the impact of partial harvesting treatments with diverse understories compared to monoculture clear-cut stands in terms of the next mountain pine beetle outbreak, for example, or pick your pest, right? If we set this up, maybe we'll be able to answer some of those questions in the future. But I don't even know if we know what some of those questions are right now. But just that idea of setting the stage for it to be able to ask some of those questions in the future. Maybe there's going to be rules to be asking some of it now. We've had some conversations about incorporating some of these treatments, modeling fire risk, for example. Maybe that's something we can start doing with these different treatments right from the beginning. But all these ideas here. So I forget the next part of the question, of course.
About the role of possible pest insects and pathogens that might affect your adaptation strategies.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, what we've been talking about here is mostly the trees. So those the species selection tool I showed was about trees. How do we combine that now with the future projections for ranges of different insects, for example? I don't know. Hopefully that comes out in some of the landscape modeling. Can we model both how we're expecting our silvicultural treatments to impact the landscape versus what do we know what's going to happen with spruce budworm in the future? I don't know. But can we start kind of modeling some of those out together? So again, I think those are really interesting questions, but that's where we're at right now, is we don't have answers to those things right now. And honestly, I'm not expecting to get answers from this project right now on them. But again, maybe we'll be able to set it up for the future, because they're all of this is interlinked together, right? So I've been talking mostly about trees, but we can talk about other vegetation. We can talk about insects. We can talk about different pathogens, whatever it might be that we're interested in, and how they all interact together is a big question right now. Yeah, so I don't know if there is a right answer to any of that right now, other than if we set up an experiment like this, maybe we'll be able to answer some of that more in the future.
You talk like a true scientist. Thank you, Brett.
Okay, I think we have time for 2 more questions. James, you're up next. I'll just allow you to talk and you can go ahead and unmute.
Great, thanks for that. I was just looking for my unmute button and it showed up when you said that. So yeah, thanks, Brad. Awesome presentation. I'm really looking forward to establishing a research trial here in Nova Scotia. James Steenberg with the province here in Nova Scotia. And I guess my question is to you, but also to other people on the call, and maybe people want to throw it in the chat or something like that, is I'm very curious to hear about what others think of the local question / sort of wildcard silviculture treatment in these trials. And something I've been thinking a lot about lately for our trial. And as we talked about, Brad, when we had that chat there, natural regeneration is kind of a big focus in Nova Scotia right now. We have a lot of partial harvests on public land, shelter woods and so forth, and not a lot of planting. And also, as an aside, a comment for the Theme 5 researchers that some of our industrial licensees are not planting trees at all because they can't hire tree planters. But we're really looking at pre-commercial thinning, and pre-commercial thinning is a tool for adaptation and as a tool for restoration. But I've been throwing around other ideas like mechanical weeding for competition control in place of herbicide application, and also liming. I guess we have more of a legacy in Nova Scotia of acid rain impacts in other jurisdictions, but yeah, just really keen to hear what others have on the go for their local question, and if there's anyone that wants to start up a sub chat or whatever for tending based silvicultural treatments for that application, I'd be keen to talk.
Yeah, no, I think that's one of the exciting parts here is I think you highlighted a lot of the ideas that people have been talking about, and so I've been meeting with the different groups across the country. Competition control has come up multiple times, in different ways. I think that's one that people are very interested in, whether it's intra-specific competition. Yep, I think that is an important question. Natural regeneration is another one that comes up. Planting, so kind of like stock characteristics, things like that, is another one that comes up. Then there's other ones on, other questions in there is, part of this was also about the diversity, and oftentimes when we're talking biological diversity, a lot of that is in these kind of rare species. So are there rare species? That's another one that's come up. Is there a rare species in your area? I don't know what that would be necessarily, but that it's part of our ecosystem, but not a big part of it. Maybe looking at the regeneration of species like that. That's another one. Or there's species that are of other significance. So one that we've talked about a little bit here in Alberta is something like white birch. It's not a particularly big commercial species, but there's a lot of other values that are associated with white birch. So is it species like that which tend to get unevaluated in our traditional kind of timber-based analysis that we should be looking at in a little bit more detail? So I think all of those are within the realm of it. And again, is hopefully that's some of the things, if once we get these local steering committee established, maybe that'll be part of the discussion. Maybe that'll become really clear that there's ideas that some researchers, some industry folks have. Maybe there's some other ideas that the other community members have as to what it is that we really want to be addressing here. And maybe it'll become very clear. It'll be maybe that will become clear once you kind of get that group and start having that discussions together. One of the things that we find is that there's lots of ideas, and we all have tons of ideas, right? That's what we do as researchers, is come up with ideas and questions more so than anything else. And we can do that here. But I think maybe once we start having those discussions, is that when we get those other voices involved in that, maybe it'll become really clear what is that would be the best bang for your buck, so to speak.
Yeah, that's awesome. No, great. Thanks, Brad. Appreciate it. Yeah, I know there's been talks of, on some of our sites in Western Nova Scotia, which tends to favor towards more nutrient poor sites with, black spruce and so forth, of, traditional pre-commercial thinning is leaning towards spruce fir, obviously production, to feed the mills. But, maybe for adaptation purposes, we try and favor, red oak, white pine kind of systems that can grow on these sites. So I'm really looking forward to seeing this developed. And yeah, great. Appreciate it.
Awesome. Yeah, no, and as with all the site leads here, this is you're seeing how much work this is going to be, right? And it's it doesn't happen without people taking a personal investment in making this happen. So thanks for that too.
Thanks.
All right, I think we have time for our one last question. Amanda, I've just enabled you to be able to ask your question, so you can unmute.
Okay, perfect. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. All right, Brad. Yeah, thank you for the talk. Mine was kind of along the lines of what Dan was relating to earlier. Are you going to be imposing like some sort of additional risk management in terms of, things like getting into a heat dome year or something? Lucky you, during the year you try to plant this trial, are you going to do maybe a more aggressive mechanical site prep to help benefit the seedlings so that you don't have a vegetation management trial by accident and watch things go, right? Are you going to impose some other silvicultural treatments just as a baseline to help get your initial planting over the hump? Because it sure be sad to set it up and watch it die right away.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And so this is what we've talked about. And one of the challenges is we've got this set up from everywhere from northern British Columbia or across to, southern Nova Scotia, and everywhere in between. So the range of sites that we're dealing with, the range of ecosystems that we're dealing with is huge. It's very, the range is hugely different, right, across there. So again, I don't think we want to say you have to do this at every single site, because that just doesn't make sense in some places where it makes perfect sense in other places. So again, what we're trying to do is set up the structure to, if maybe some places do site prep, maybe some places just don't do site prep for lots of good reasons, right? So if we want to do it, what we've been saying essentially, let's take site prep for an example, or competition control, for example. Let's take site prep. But the premise holds for all of these things is, if you're going to do it on some of it, you got to do it everywhere. And what we don't want to do is, we don't want to be convoluting our treatments, right? So if we only did it in the clear cut area, but not in the partial harvest scenario, for example, or if we only did it on the on the future species, but not on the current revegetation standards, well, then we wouldn't know is what was it that made that successful and what didn't make it successful. So if you're going to be doing those things, and there's lots of good reasons to do it, we should be making sure that we're doing it everywhere, so that we're not confusing the experiment. So I think that's going to be the challenge here.
Okay. But yeah, I mean, that's going to be tricky for the partial harvest and clear cut, because you
Absolutely.
can't do the same MSP in those necessarily, right? The compatibility isn't there because of the retention. So
Yep. Yeah, no, this is, that's gonna be a huge challenge, is what are we gonna do in those areas? Competition control, maybe you could do something a little bit different. We can do it different ways in there. Site prep, there is, again, it's possible to do it in some of these areas. It's more expensive, it's a lot harder. But we don't want to be questioning the results afterwards by only having treatments and replicate with some of them, or cross with some of them, or things like that. So that's kind of the experimental part of it, is how do you balance that with some of the operational stuff that we're experiencing, and a lot of these questions that are coming up at all the sites, really.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, that's our last question, and we just passed the hour. So thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you, Brad, again for presenting and answering all those wonderful questions. So for our next webinar, we'll be having it on March 11th, and we'll be hearing from Olivier Villemar-Cote, who's our Theme 2 lead for the Diverse Project. So keep your eyes out for more information on that. And in the meantime, I linked the YouTube channel if you're curious to watch our old videos of our previous webinars if you haven't seen them yet. But let us know if you have any questions, comments about the project. We're happy to engage with people. So yeah, have a great rest of your day, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.